Welcome to Dialogue. This deep dive is part of a continuing series where we've been examining documented, real-world examples of political influence.
We've been calling it dirty politics, mainly because of the mechanisms they use to get around open democratic choice.
Today we are turning our attention to Case 12. This one focuses specifically on the Atlantic Council and the broader ecosystem of similar high-profile players.
Right, what we all commonly call think tanks.
And this case study is a bit different from some of the others we've covered in the series.
Very different. We're not talking about outright illegal activity or, covert suppression.
No. Here, the influence machine operates completely legally. It's even transparent in a way.
Which is what makes it arguably one of the most powerful mechanisms for shaping policy outcomes today.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to understand how powerful interests learn to speak a different language.
It's not the loud, abrasive accent of propaganda. It's the neutral, quiet tone of objective expertise.
That's a great way to put it. It's a crucial distinction.
It is. Because when we place this kind of structural influence under the umbrella of dirty politics, we're talking about a strategy that doesn't need coercion. It doesn't need bribes.
It advises. It translates.
Exactly. It works to narrow the democratic debate by manufacturing a kind of pre-vetted consensus. And it's all backed by what looks like completely independent research.
So the goal isn't to silence dissenting voices after they've already spoken.
No, not at all.
The goal is to make certain policy options sound so fundamentally unserious.
So ridiculous, even.
That they never even make it to the podium in the first place. This is about preemptive policy curation.
It's an institutional filter. That's the bottom line. It ensures that by the time an issue gets to a government official or a cable news segment,
the menu's already been set.
The acceptable range of solutions has already been optimized for the interests of the stakeholders who fund the entire operation to begin with.
Okay, so let's really unpack this. The difference between the presentation and the actual function of these organizations.
It's everything.
When we hear think tank, I think we all picture something very specific. Independent research institutions, right?
Policy-neutral analysts, academics, people bridging that gap between deep scholarship and the messy realities of governance.
That's the image they project.
And that image is absolutely vital to their entire operation. But the function, that's where the subtle power really lies.
And what is that function exactly?
They function as agenda translator.
Translators, what do you mean by that?
They take complex, often very narrow, profit-driven interests, and they translate them into this universal, high-minded policy language.
They're consensus builders.
Powerful consensus builders. But above all, you have to think of them as legitimacy engines.
Legitimacy engines. I like that. So what are the components of that engine? It's not just about, writing a paper and publishing it.
No, of course not. What gives that paper the political weight that, say, an internal corporate white paper would lack?
Right.
It's a mix of presentation and institutional history. First, you have the aesthetic.
The look and feel.
Polished reports, academic footnotes, a high-profile masthead with impressive names. It's all designed to mimic university research.
Which lends it this inherent credibility.
Instantly. And second, there's the personnel. They recruit former government officials, former diplomats.
People who already have deep access and an intimate knowledge of how the policy levers actually work.
Exactly. And those individuals carried the legitimacy of their past office with them into this new institution.
So the goal isn't necessarily to dictate a specific action. It's more about building an intellectual scaffolding around a preferred action.
Yes, making it seem like the only logical choice.
They define the field of play so narrowly that their preferred policy looks not just reasonable, but
inevitable.
Inevitable.
Right.
Precisely. If they can produce a series of detailed, heavily footnoted reports that demonstrate that, say, policy A leads to fiscal collapse.
And policy B is diplomatically impossible.
Then policy C, which just so happens to be the one aligned with their funding priorities, is no longer just an option on the table.
It's the only responsible option. It's the only responsible option available to any serious decision maker. They've supplied all the necessary justification.
The Atlantic Council is just a perfect example of this structure in action, isn't it?
A classic case. Founded in 1961, deep roots in transatlantic security in cooperation.
And it positions itself as explicitly nonpartisan.
Which is key. How does a history of perceived neutrality and public service become part of that legitimacy engine?
It's a powerful shield.
It is. Decades of working on big issues like NATO expansion, global security. that establishes a reputation that is very, very hard to shake.
And what's fascinating about this whole mechanism is this paradox of transparency. It
Yes,
seems to operate best when it's all out in the open.
it absolutely does.
Okay, I have to challenge that a bit,
Yeah.
because we typically assume secrecy equals dirty politics. So how can radical transparency actually amplify influence?
Because disclosure replaces suspicion with normalization.
Normalization.
Think about it. If the Atlantic Council lists a major defense contractor, a foreign government, and a U.S. government agency as donors on its annual report, they're not hiding anything.
They're declaring it.
They are declaring a widely accepted business model. The fact that their funding isn't a secret is the point.
If it were secret, it would look like a conspiracy.
It would. But because it's public, it just looks like how governance works in the modern era.
That is a fundamental inversion of how we're taught to think about this stuff.
It is.
We're trained to look for the hidden agenda, the dark money, the anonymous shell corporation.
Right.
But here, the power actually comes from standing in the sunlight and declaring, yes, these are the stakeholders who are deeply invested in the policy outcomes we research, and by the way, here is our expert consensus.
And critically, the entire policy ecosystem, the world of diplomats, congressional aides, bureaucrats, they accept that relationship.
As just a normal input into the policy debate.
Exactly. They don't see a defense contractor donation followed by a paper recommending more defense spending as a scandal.
They see it as an interested party providing resources and expertise to study an important issue.
And that normalization process, that is the core function of the legitimacy engine.
Okay, let's look closer at that normalization engine by detailing the financial model. Because it's not just about one major corporate donor, is it?
No, not at all. It's a deliberately blended, diverse financial structure.
Designed to maximize credibility and insulation.
The diversity of the funding is crucial for maintaining that nonpartisan aesthetic.
Right, because if you're funded by 50 different entities,
Even if 30 of them are ideologically or commercially aligned on an issue.
it's much harder for a critic to dismiss the research as just serving one master.
It's almost impossible. And we see this significant mix of publicly disclosed funding sources.
So give us the inventory. Who are the heavy hitters financing this kind of institutional research?
First, you have significant governmental funding. This includes U.S. government agencies like the Department of State, but also NATO-aligned governments directly. Second, you have high-stakes private sector money. Major defense contractors who rely on policy decisions for multi-billion-dollar contracts.
Technology firms with huge interests in digital regulation and, information governance.
And of course, large energy companies whose entire operations are fundamentally dependent on geopolitical stability and regulatory environments.
And often we also see foreign governments and state-linked entities in the mix, correct?
Absolutely. Which introduces a whole other layer of complexity regarding, whose national interest is being served.
So this blended model, it really ensures alignment across major policy areas.
It does. For instance, if you have a center focused on global energy transitions.
You will likely get significant support from both traditional fossil fuel companies and green tech investors.
Right. And what does that do? It ensures the resulting policy options accommodate the interests of all high-level industry players.
Making any kind of truly disruptive or radical change pretty unlikely.
Very unlikely.
So let's go back to that key question. Why doesn't this disclosure inherently damage the institution's influence? What's the practical implication of all this transparency?
The disclosure doesn't just neutralize criticism. It actually establishes an accepted framework for what you could call policy entanglement.
Policy entanglement, I like that.
By making the corporate, the governmental, and the institutional money visible, the policy community tacitly agrees that this is just the established cost of informed governance.
It stops being a question of should these interests be financing policy research.
And it simply becomes how things are done.
So the structure itself is the mechanism for the dirty politics.
It is the mechanism.
It's a self-reinforcing system where the researchers, who might be incredibly brilliant people,
They often are.
but the fundamental framing of their research, what questions get asked, and just as importantly, which ones don't, was already determined by the financial landscape they operate in.
Precisely. We are talking about structural bias, not individual motive.
Right.
If a researcher produces a detailed economic forecast and their organization's largest funders just happen to be the beneficiaries of that forecast,
The government official who cites that report gets a powerful shield.
a very powerful shield, they can point to the think tank report and say, we followed independent expertise.
And that deflects the criticism that they were just following the bidding of a single interested party.
It turns influence into consensus.
And because the funding is all aggregated, it's notoriously difficult for a critic or a journalist to draw a direct line between donor X and policy paper Y in a way that's, airtight for public consumption.
That aggregation provides plausible deniability.
A perfect out.
You can say, yes, major defense contractor Z funds us, but you can immediately follow that up with, but they represent less than 5% of our overall budget.
Which is supported by 24 other governments, NGOs, and corporations, demonstrating our diverse and balanced perspective.
It's a brilliant defense mechanism against the kind of accountability the public normally demands.
And this structure enables a mechanism that, well, we're calling narrative laundering.
A very clean three-step process.
For turning the narrow interests of sponsors into what ultimately becomes widely accepted policy consensus. Let's walk through those steps.
Okay. Step 1 is framing. This is, I think, the most critical stage.
The setup.
The setup. The research doesn't just start with a neutral inquiry. It begins by framing the issue in a specific light that inherently limits the scope of possible answers.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Let's say the underlying goal is to mandate certain cybersecurity measures that disproportionately benefit a specific set of tech providers. The initial research question won't be, what is the best way to secure the grid?
No, it'll be something much more specific.
It will be, given the unprecedented level of foreign state threat, what are the most immediate and decisive actions necessary to enhance national cyber resilience, focusing specifically on public-private partnership protocols?
That shift is massive.
It's huge. The debate immediately skips the fundamentals.
Are those threats truly unprecedented? Should the solution be mandatory or voluntary? Does it infringe on civil liberties?
All those questions are gone. The frame shifts the discussion from should we act to how aggressively should we implement this pre-approved action.
So once that framing is set, we move to step 2, the introduction of options.
This is where the policy papers get released. The research meticulously dismisses options that run counter to the desired outcome.
So alternatives like radical deregulation or non-intervention or even just diplomacy.
They're described using terms that make them sound politically or fiscally impossible.
While the acceptable options are presented as responsible, measured, and pragmatic.
Exactly. Imagine a policy brief on, say, Section 230, reform the law that protects online platforms.
Right.
A paper funded by major tech platforms wouldn't propose eliminating 230. That would be too obvious.
Yeah.
Instead, it would introduce 3 options, all of which involve platforms internally self-regulating according to best practices.
Which are defined by the think tank, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
And that preempts actual government intervention while making the platforms look proactive.
The genius is that the options they introduce are often just incremental variations of the status quo.
It ensures that regardless of which option policymakers choose, the underlying structural balance and the financial interests of the sponsors remains intact.
Which leads directly to step 3, repetition and dissemination.
The heavy lifting. The research is done, the options are narrowed. Now comes the hard work of making the public believe this is established fact.
And this is done through a relentless circuit of panels, conferences, and seminars.
The same fellows, the same high-level government officials, the same industry reps who often funded the research in the first place.
All sitting on a stage, repeating the precise framing and the narrowed set of responsible options.
The visual of the panel circuit, same faces, different lanyards, same conclusions, is a perfect illustration of manufactured consensus in action.
And this repetition is then amplified through media appearances.
Where the institution's title lends instant gravitas, the outcome is that when government officials or policymakers have to make a decision, they don't have to look far for justification.
No, they just reference this already massive footnoted body of work as the established consensus of independent experts.
And what this mechanism achieves is profound. No direct orders are needed. No secret payments have to be traced.
The influence scales automatically because the policy solution sounds exactly like objective, nonpartisan expertise.
Created by people who were specifically framed to seem like they're operating above the entire fray.
And that laundering process would completely fail without a robust amplifier.
Absolutely.
Which is where the partnership with major media and technology platforms comes in.
They're structurally embedded in the information ecosystem. They aren't just passively available for a comment.
No, we see formal media partnerships that guarantee airtime, ensure sympathetic coverage.
And they hold these critical advisory roles with major tech companies on huge issues like information security, content moderation, election integrity protocols.
They are the preferred, pre-vetted source of credible opinion.
Right. If a major foreign policy crisis erupts, the media needs an instant, authoritative voice that sounds serious and non-hysterical.
And the think tank, often having prepared detailed, pre-justified talking points on that exact crisis,
Funded, conveniently, by stakeholders with an interest in the outcome.
is ready to deliver that voice on a silver platter.
And this brings us to the ultimate credibility shortcut, the power of the title.
When a talking head is introduced on television, they're not introduced with their full biography, are they?
Never. No mention of their financial conflicts.
They're just introduced as senior fellow at the Atlantic Council.
And in the speed of a 24-hour news cycle, that title provides a massive cognitive break for the viewer.
It automatically implies objectivity, rigorous research.
And a perceived distance from the messy realities of corporate power or profit, even when the reality is completely different.
But doesn't the host or the media organization have a responsibility to provide that context? The fact that this senior fellow's expertise is funded by a massive defense contractor or a foreign state.
Legally, they've adhered to the disclosure rules. It's often aggregated on a website's donor page that, let's be honest, nobody reads.
Right.
In the rush of television, no one is going to provide the full context of the funding streams that support that specific initiative, or the institutional incentives guiding the research, or the overlap between the fellow's professional history and the sponsor's interests.
That level of detail kills the instant credibility the media needs to fill the segment.
So the system is mutually beneficial.
The media platform gets instant, legitimate-sounding authority to fill airtime.
And the think tank gets its pre-vetted consensus amplified directly into the national conversation, burying all the necessary context about its funding structure.
It's a symbiotic relationship that sustains the entire structure of influence.
Think about the alternative for a second. If a true independent academic, maybe from a university that isn't reliant on these major corporate or government grants, were to challenge the mainstream consensus,
They would lack the powerful title, they wouldn't have the media relationships.
they wouldn't have the infrastructure to instantly cut through the noise. They might have better, more objective research, but they lack the necessary political legitimacy.
That's a subtle but really damning point. The ability to penetrate the policy conversation is more dependent on organizational authority and media access than on the inherent quality or objectivity of the research itself.
So let's shift our focus to how this linguistic boundary drawing works in specific policy areas.
Because this isn't about outright censorship. It's about controlling the vocabulary of what's considered an acceptable debate.
And foreign policy is probably the clearest example of this.
How so?
When institutions like the Atlantic Council weigh in, the language they use immediately gatekeeps the discussion. If they favor a policy like increased military aid or new sanctions,
Those policies get tagged with what you call consensus magnets.
stability enhancing, rules-based international order compliant, defensive measures to ensure sovereignty.
And who wants to argue against a rules-based order? The language is designed to make any opposition sound completely irrational.
Of course. But how do they linguistically neutralize the alternatives? Things like genuine diplomacy, de-escalation, non-interventionism.
They get framed with political poison.
Naive idealism, irresponsible abandonment of allies, unilateral retreat, or maybe the most damning term in these policy circles, outside the established consensus.
The language transforms a legitimate political choice into a question of professional competence.
It does. For example, instead of a serious debate about the long-term strategic costs of increasing military presence in a volatile region,
The discussion is framed around whether one side is serious about deterrence versus the other side being willing to sacrifice stability for naive domestic political gain.
it creates a totally false dichotomy. The only path presented as serious or politically viable is the one favored by the institution's core stakeholders.
So no physical censorship or legal threat is necessary.
None. The boundaries are drawn linguistically before any politician or journalist even begins their analysis. By branding certain policies as inherently irresponsible, you create career risk for anyone advocating them.
Let's look at another powerful example. Technology and information governance. This is where the coherence of the whole ecosystem really shines.
Oh, absolutely. In the tech space, think tanks are advising platforms on everything from content moderation algorithms to election integrity measures.
And when these major platforms face public scrutiny about censorship or political bias, what's their immediate defense?
They cite independent expert guidance.
Often pointing to reports commissioned by or featuring fellows from institutions like the Atlantic Council's digital programs. They're seeking that legitimacy shield.
To justify decisions that might otherwise look arbitrary or politically motivated.
Right.
But here is the critical loop. These independent experts are housed in institutions funded by the same network of governments, defense contractors, and technology companies that have a direct financial or regulatory interest in the outcomes they're advising on.
So if a think tank center, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense and several large social media platforms, advises on what constitutes foreign state-linked disinformation,
That advice is then used by the social media platforms to moderate content. It creates this powerful, closed, self-referential system.
it allows governments and corporations to effectively outsource the defining of responsible online behavior.
To an ostensibly neutral third party, which helps them avoid the direct appearance of state or corporate censorship.
The system is perfectly coherent because everyone inside it benefits from it remaining closed and self-validating.
It's a perfect example of influence maximized through structural compliance.
One of the most cynical but also brilliant aspects of this case is how these organizations have perfected legal compliance.
That's the core insight. This is not a violation of the rules. It is a meticulous adherence to them.
This form of dirty politics is built on perfecting compliance rather than violating it.
They adhere to all the necessary legal hurdles. They disclose donors, even if it's aggregated. They publish extensive footnotes to maintain that academic aesthetic.
And they avoid direct, registered lobbying, which would require much more transparent reporting.
By meticulously operating within the lines, they inoculate themselves against accusations of illegality.
Which makes the resulting consensus seem even more robust and beyond reproach. They are legally, fiscally, and structurally sound, which reinforces their policy authority.
And this adherence gives them the ultimate shield when critics inevitably arrive.
When someone tries to challenge the system by pointing out the funding biases or the pre-vetted conclusions,
They're immediately met with a highly effective, standardized deflection mechanism.
what are the key phrases of that deflection? I think people will recognize them.
The criticism is dismissed as anti-expertise, suggesting the critic just doesn't value serious, data-driven policy work.
They're accused of not grasping policy complexity.
Which implies their alternative ideas are too simplistic for the real world. But the most common and effective dismissal is the world-weary shrug. This is simply how governance works.
And what makes that last one so tricky is that it contains a partial truth. Policy is complex,
It is.
and specialized input is required for modern governance.
Exactly. The deflection works because it forces the critic to argue not just against the conclusion, but against the accepted mechanisms of the policy world itself.
But the picture they present is incomplete.
Very incomplete. Governance may require expertise, but the think tank model maximizes access, reputation management, and crucially, relentless repetition.
Ensuring only one specific flavor of expertise is consumed by decision makers.
And if the consensus were truly organic, a genuine convergence of academic thought.
You wouldn't need a constant year-round circuit of policy conferences to sell it.
It's like watching a movie trailer loop in the theater lobby for 2 straight years. Eventually, you start to believe that movie is the only option in existence.
It feels less like an intellectual breakthrough and more like a carefully managed market saturation campaign for a policy product.
The panel circuit is where the humor and the cynicism of the system really meet.
Same faces, different name badges.
Hammering home the exact same 5 talking points until they become institutional reality.
The humor is dark, but the point stands. The sheer effort dedicated to disseminating a single set of conclusions suggests a vested interest in the outcome, far beyond the neutral pursuit of truth.
So for you, the listener, trying to quickly grasp the importance of this case, you have to connect this systematic influence directly to its real-world policy stakes.
Because this process is how specific policy outcomes that are often highly costly to the public or highly beneficial to corporate sponsors, become normalized.
They become viewed as inevitable.
This mechanism explains huge, costly societal shifts. It's how military engagement becomes linguistically framed as an unavoidable stability operation.
It's how massive government spending on specific weapon systems becomes perceived as necessary modernization,
It's how restrictive austerity measures get deemed necessary corrective economics.
and how military escalation is successfully rebranded as deterrence rather than risk acceleration.
These outcomes are not the result of explicit corruption.
No, they're the result of the manufacturing of a policy consensus that ensures only a narrow band of fiscally responsible, stakeholder-friendly solutions ever enters the decision-making pipeline.
The entire policy process shifts from a genuine democratic choice to a pre-structured consultation.
It does.
And if we place this alongside our previous cases of dirty politics, the function of the think tank model is incredibly sophisticated.
Cases like COINTELPRO focused on actively suppressing dissent through illegal means, surveillance-chilled participation. Those methods involve blockage and punishment.
This model is fundamentally different. It's about pre-approval and friction reduction.
It sets the boundaries and limits the options before any significant public resistance can even get organized.
This layer of institutional influence reduces the political friction necessary to pass expensive, complex, or often unpopular policies.
Because the foundation has already been laid by a layer of independent experts who guaranteed its legitimacy from the start.
It's the ultimate filter. No one in the think tank system necessarily has to violate their personal code or lie outright.
No, they don't. They only need to agree on what questions are serious enough to fund, what risks are acceptable to tolerate, and what outcomes are realistically viable within the existing geopolitical and corporate landscape.
Once those initial systemic boundaries are set and accepted as the starting point,
Democracy is effectively converted from an open choice between all possible options into a structured, consultative process where the menu has already been highly curated.
dirty politics, in this sophisticated form, often filters information rather than hiding it.
Ensuring that only the most useful perspectives gain the neutral, powerful accent of expertise.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.